It started as a normal walk. Late in the evening, Peter left the house saying he just needed some air. The night felt wrong, too quiet. No cars, no voices. Even the streetlights seemed dimmer than usual, as if they were trying to save power. He turned a corner, and the town changed. The houses were still there, but they looked off. Windows were dark. The road was wet. The air felt heavy and cold. Dust floated slowly, even though there was no wind. Every step Peter took sounded too loud. He realized he couldn't find his way back. Quog was empty. Stores were open, but inside there was nothing. Phones didn't work. Clocks in the windows were frozen. Time wasn't moving here. Peter started to panic. He shouted for Lois. He laughed, trying to make it feel less scary. His voice came back to him with a delay, like someone was repeating it a second later. Then he saw himself. Another Peter stood in the middle of the street. He looked cleaner, calmer. His face showed no emotion. He watched closely, like he was studying him. The other Peter spoke quietly. He knew everything. The house, the kids' names, what Peter had done yesterday. He said this was the real Quog. The normal one was just a loud, messy copy. Here, nothing changed, nothing left. Peter tried to run, but the streets closed in on him. Houses repeated. Every road led to another broken version of a familiar place. At some point, Peter noticed the other one was no longer following him. He was waiting. In the morning, Lois saw Peter in the kitchen. He sat straight, calm, drinking coffee, listening. He didn't joke. He didn't shout. He didn't laugh. The house became quieter. Sometimes Peter stopped and stared at the wall, like he was listening to something no one else could hear. Sometimes he checked the doors and windows, not to escape, but to make sure nothing could come in. Somewhere in the cold, empty version of the town, the other Peter was still walking the streets, laughing too loudly, calling for his family, but he was never coming home. The episode begins with something completely ordinary. Peter and Brian are walking down the street, joking around, enjoying an evening stroll. Peter tells a dumb joke. Brian gives his usual sarcastic chuckle. Everything feels normal, until a stray dog, dirty, wild-looking, fur bristling, suddenly runs out from behind a parked car. It lunges at Brian, bites him, and bolts into the distance before Peter even realizes what happened. "Whoa! Brian, are you okay?" Peter shouts. Brian looks at him, and in that moment Peter freezes. Brian's pupils suddenly dilate, massively, unnaturally, spreading like black ink across his eyes. For a second, his expression goes blank, empty, like he doesn't recognize the world around him. "I'm fine," Brian says, too calmly, too emotionlessly, like he's repeating someone else's words. Peter doesn't believe him. The next day, Brian looks worse, much worse. His pupils stay huge even in bright light. The fur around his neck stands up as if permanently electrified. His canines are longer, sharper, visible even when his mouth is closed. He barely speaks, and when he does, it sounds like two voices are overlapping. That evening, he paces the house in long, quiet steps that leave no sound behind. Peter catches glimpses of his shadow bending strangely on the walls, lagging a half-second behind his movements. Stewie eventually says, "Peter, I'm taking him outside. I think something's wrong with him." And Stewie leaves with Brian. Hours pass, then Brian returns. Alone, Peter rushes to him. "Brian, where's Stewie? Where is he?" Brian looks up slowly and smiles, a huge, unnatural smile stretching too far across his muzzle. Then he starts laughing. Not a normal laugh, a broken, echoing, strangled laugh. Stewie never comes back. Terrified, Peter and Lois drive Brian to an animal shelter, hoping vets will help him. Medicine, testing, anything. The staff say they'll keep him under supervision. They promise everything is under control. Days pass. The house grows quiet, too quiet. One evening, Peter comes home earlier than usual. He opens the front door and instantly feels something wrong. The air inside is cold, heavy, unmoving. Lois? Chris? Meg? No voices, no footsteps, no sounds. He steps deeper into the house, and then he sees it. Brian is standing in the middle of the living room. But it isn't Brian anymore. Before Peter stands a massive creature, towering, monstrous. His neck fur has grown into a full bristling mane. His fangs are enormous, jutting out even when his mouth is closed. His limbs are thick, powerful, and his chest rises with slow, thunderous breaths. His eyes glow faintly red. And most terrifying of all, he stands upright on two legs, like a person. Shadows tremble around him as if the room is too small to contain him. Peter steps back. The creature steps forward, and in a soft, eerily gentle voice it says, "I came back, Peter." The episode opens calmly. Brian is sitting on the living room couch, a little too happy, a little too relaxed, smiling in a way that lingers just a bit longer than it should. He flips through TV channels with an unusual lightness, as if nothing in the world could bother him. When Lois walks through the front door, she immediately notices how quiet the house feels. "Brian," she calls, "where's Peter?" Brian doesn't even look up. No idea, he must have gone out somewhere. His voice is calm, unnaturally calm, as though he had rehearsed the line in advance. Lois watches him for a few seconds longer than normal. Something about his expression seems off. The smile too steady, the eyes too relaxed. That night, the house is filled with heavy silence. Lois lies in bed alone. Peter still hasn't come home. She's drifting off when she hears soft footsteps climbing the stairs. The bedroom door slowly opens. Brian stands in the doorway. He looks at her with wide, calm eyes and quietly asks, "Do you want me to sleep with you tonight?" Lois freezes. "Brian, that's inappropriate." Peter's not here," he interrupts softly. "But I am." And before she can react, Brian climbs into the bed beside her as if it's completely natural. Lois stays rigid, unsure what to do. What disturbs her more than anything is how quickly Brian falls asleep. Perfectly still, perfectly peaceful, as if everything is unfolding exactly the way he wants. The next few days get even stranger. Brian begins acting like the head of the household, cooking breakfast, checking on the kids, reminding everyone about chores. He's cheerful, too cheerful. He seems to be slipping into Peter's role piece by piece. The mannerisms, the confidence, the authority. And the most unsettling part, no one besides Lois seems to notice. Whenever she asks where Peter is, Brian answers, "He'll be back soon." But his eyes never match the smile. One evening, Lois hears a faint noise in the basement, a weak, pained groan. Heart pounding, she slowly descends the stairs and switches on the dim basement light. And she almost screams. In the far corner, lying on the floor, bruised, tied, and barely breathing, is Peter. When he sees her, he struggles to lift his head and whispers, "Lois, he won't let me out." She falls to her knees beside him, frantically trying to untie his wrists. Her hands shake, but just as she loosens the knot, the light flickers. The basement door creaks open. Brian stands at the top of the stairs. He isn't surprised. He isn't scared. He looks annoyed, as if Lois has broken a rule he set. He descends 2 steps and says quietly, "You shouldn't have come down here, Lois. I told you not to." Lois positions herself in front of Peter, shielding him. "What did you do to him?" she screams. Brian doesn't answer the question. He simply reaches up and closes the basement door with unsettling calm. Clank. The lock drops into place on the outside. "You two stay here," he says. "The family needs order, and I can give it to them." The light flickers again. Peter's breathing is shallow. Lois pounds on the door, yelling, but the house stays silent. The The final shot shows Brian walking back upstairs, steady and deliberate. Behind him, from the basement, we hear Lois calling out for the kids, but no one answers. It all started so quietly that Peter didn't even notice anything was wrong at first. Brian just looked unwell. He spent more time lying on the couch, breathing slowly, blinking heavily, like he had some kind of cold he wasn't talking about. His voice was weaker. Lois brought him food. Chris covered him with a blanket. Stewie even joked that Brian was finally acting like an elderly dog. But Peter noticed something odd. Every night, at around the same time, Brian disappeared for a couple of hours. Peter heard slow, dragging footsteps in the hallway, almost like Brian was pacing half asleep. But whenever Peter got up to look, the hallway was empty. On the third day, everything changed. Brian suddenly said he felt amazing. Too amazing. He walked around the house with strange, unnatural energy, humming softly, cleaning things, complimenting everyone for tiny things. "You look wonderful today, Lois." "Meg, you're doing great." "Peter, I really appreciate you." His voice was too gentle, too even, and the way he smiled. His eyes stayed a little too wide. The family loved this new Brian. But Peter felt something wrong beneath it. One night, Peter woke up and saw Brian standing at the end of the hallway, staring at the wall, completely motionless. What are you doing?" Peter asked. Brian twitched slightly, like he had forgotten anyone else existed, and said, "Just thinking." But his mouth didn't move correctly when he said it. The next day, the first truly frightening thing happened. Brian stretched and yawned, and for a split second, Peter saw long, sharp fangs inside his mouth, far bigger than a dog should ever have. But Brian snapped his mouth shut instantly. "Peter, you're exhausted," he said softly. "You imagined it." That night, Brian's breathing became deep and low, like someone inhaling through a cavern. The fur around his neck began rising on its own, forming a strange, ragged mane. The house began to sound different. The walls seemed to vibrate slightly, and in the morning, Peter noticed Lois was gone. Her room was untouched, bed perfectly made, everything neat, but she was nowhere. Meg didn't answer. Chris didn't come to breakfast. All their rooms were empty, too clean, too silent. Only Brian remained. He sat by the window, back perfectly straight, staring outside. "Where is everyone?" Peter demanded. Brian didn't turn around. "They're fine," he said. "I told them to rest." His voice was warm, too warm, which only made it worse. The next evening, Peter returned home after work and felt a wave of cold air hit him as he stepped inside. The house was dark, quiet. Not cartoon quiet, real quiet, heavy and suffocating. "Lois? Kids?" No reply, just slow, heavy breathing coming from the living room. Peter flicked on the light. Brian was standing in the center of the room, standing, not sitting, and he looked wrong. He had grown, taller, broader, heavier. The fur along his back and neck stood up like jagged spikes. His shadow stretched across the entire wall, moving with each breath as if it had its own pulse. His eyes shone with a glassy, reflective glow. "Brian, buddy, what's happening?" Peter whispered. Brian turned his head, but far too much, far too easily, at an angle no dog's neck should make. "Peter," he said softly, "you shouldn't have come back." Peter backed toward the door, gripping a chair with shaking hands. "Where is my family? Where are they?" Brian took one slow, heavy step. The floor groaned under his weight. "They're resting," he repeated. "I told them I'd take care of everything now." Peter grabbed a lamp like a weapon. "You're not Brian," he whispered. Brian smiled, a smile too wide, stretching a little too far. "I'm better," he said, and lunged. The lights flickered, the frame shook, and Peter's scream was swallowed by a deep, monstrous roar that made the whole room tremble. When the lights came back, the living room was empty. Completely empty. Only one figure remained. Brian, or whatever he had become, sat calmly on the couch, breathing slowly, staring straight ahead. The house was silent around him. It all started when Brian became just a little quieter than usual. He stopped cracking jokes, barely argued with Stewie, and didn't complain about anything. At first, the family thought he was just tired, but within a couple of days, they noticed Brian's breathing had changed. Deep, slow, almost like something inside him was shifting. Peter joked it was allergies, but Lois was the first to see the muscles on Brian's back twitch, as if something under his fur was growing. That night, Brian paced around the house for hours, and every step he took sounded heavier, like he'd somehow become bigger. When Peter turned on the lights, Brian slipped into the shadows as if trying to hide. And the next morning, everyone noticed he actually was taller. Not by much, but enough to make everyone uncomfortable. On the third day, Meg disappeared. Peter walked through the whole house calling her name, but there was no answer. Brian just sat in the kitchen corner, staring at Peter without blinking, as if he knew more than he wanted to admit. Peter asked, "Brian, did you see where Meg went?" Brian slowly turned his head away. On the fourth day, Chris vanished too. His door was open, his bed messy, and his window lifted just slightly. When Peter approached Brian again, the dog didn't even look up. He just let out a long, deep breath. And in that moment, Peter thought Brian's shoulders looked broader, his claws just a little longer than before. On the fifth day, Lois never came down for breakfast. Peter searched every room in panic, calling her name, checking closets, looking outside. Nothing. The house felt too still, too empty, like something underneath it was breathing. He rushed to Brian, yelling, "Where's Lois? What's happening? Why won't you say anything?" But Brian only lifted his eyes that had grown too dark, too deep, reflecting something feral and enormous. By now, Brian took up almost half the kitchen. His chest rose and fell like a massive beast's, and his neck and shoulders were far too large for a normal dog. That night, Peter woke up to heavy footsteps moving slowly through the hallway. He stepped outside his room and saw a massive shadow passing the living room doorway. The shape was vaguely Brian-like, but far taller, almost reaching the ceiling. Peter wanted to call out, but in that moment he realized he was completely alone. Everyone else was gone, and every time he asked Brian about the missing family members, Brian simply stayed silent. On the final night, Peter gathered his courage and approached the living room. Brian was there, fully transformed now, enormous, broad, monstrous, his body rising and falling with slow, thunderous breaths. He sat in the center of the room, staring into the darkness like he was listening to something only he could hear. Peter stood a few feet away and whispered, "Brian, do you understand what you've done?" Brian slowly turned his head, looking straight at Peter with a gaze that had none of the old Brian left in it. The lights flickered. For a split second, the room was swallowed by darkness, and when the lamps came back on, Peter was gone. The house was silent again. Only Brian remained, massive, motionless, staring into the empty living room. And that's where the episode cut to black.